For 64 years, the CIA concealed the true story of what really happened in 1953 that transformed the Middle East forever. But in 2017, the intelligence agency finally declassified documents from that event. On August 19, 1953, a military coup overthrew the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. These actions led to the return of the Shah and created a pressure pot amongst the Iranian people that eventually resulted in the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The impact of this coup shapes not only the history of the Iranian people, it shapes Western foreign policy and alliances in the Middle East to this very day.
Iranians have long complained of a history of U.S. interference in their affairs and of America's role in overthrowing an Iranian government during the Cold War.
Most history books either vaguely mention or completely omit the story of Mossadegh and the coup of 1953. One can only wonder why. An event with such far-reaching consequences is hardly discussed in the context of Iran and the modern-day Middle Eastern peace process. However, decades later, we finally know why. This is the story of what really happened in Iran on August 19, 1953. For most Americans and the West, the story of Iran begins in 1979, when Iranian students seized the US Embassy in Tehran. 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days. The hostage crisis started when the US government refused to deport the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, back to Iran.
Good evening. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner, and according to a student spokesman, will be held as hostages until the deposed Shah is returned from the United States, where he's receiving medical treatment for cancer.
But to truly understand the hostage crisis, we have to go back almost 29 years to 1950.
In Abadan, the world's largest oil refinery has been handling each year 25 million tons of crude oil, fed by countless pipelines from the oil fields.
During this time, the British controlled the largest oil refinery in the world, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Based in Abadan in western Iran, the oil refinery was of great strategic importance, not only as a profit center for the British government, but also as a source of energy to run the mighty British Navy. The Navy had switched from coal to petroleum in 1911 under the leadership of then Navy Secretary Winston Churchill. So while the British were benefiting immensely from the oil in Iran, the Iranians were pretty unhappy. Well, because in exchange for extracting Iranian oil, the British government was paying Iranians less than 20% of the global profits. Furthermore, the Iranian government wasn't allowed to audit the company books nor have a voice in the company's management. In late December 1950, word got to Tehran that the Americans had made a deal with the Saudis, agreeing to a 50-50 profit sharing of the Arab American Oil Company, also known as Aramco. However, when a similar agreement was proposed by the Iranians, it was rejected by the UK Foreign Office. This led to increased turmoil in Iran. Many felt that Iran's oil fields should first and foremost benefit Iranians. One vocal advocate of this perspective was Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. On the 20th of April 1951, Mossadegh became the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran.
With chances of a settlement fading, the West's best hope is that this sickly man, in whose frail hands may lie the key to peace, is as anti-Russian as he is anti-British.
Born in 1882, he came from a prestigious Iranian family. His father, a finance minister of Iran, and his mother, a princess from the Qajar dynasty. Mossadegh became the first Iranian to receive a doctorate in law from a Western university and was often described as incorruptible, a man who didn't fear standing up to power. One of Mossadegh's first actions was to do what many people had been calling for years. On the 1st of May 1951, Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company.
Abadan, the world's largest oil refinery, which British enterprise and money built, may pass out of British control if Persia carries out the vote for nationalization passed by their parliament.
The British, as expected, were completely outraged. They felt that Mossadegh had effectively stolen their oil, even if it did exist under Iranian land. And they weren't going to back down from this fight. Apart from direct interest in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, what the British really feared was the signal that it sent to other Middle Eastern countries that they had similar arrangements with, such as Egypt and its Suez Canal. The British debated taking over the oil refinery through a naval operation, but the Americans didn't support this. Instead, the US offered to negotiate with Mossadegh on behalf of the British. However, the parties were unable to reach an agreement. Shortly after, the British, who still operated the refinery, shut it down and evacuated all British personnel. The refinery was even sabotaged to prevent the Iranians from operating it. Without the green light from the US on a military operation, the British government decides to take their case to the United Nations and International Court of Justice at The Hague. However, much to their surprise, both judgments went in favor of Iran.
That if they continue, they may render it impossible to execute a judgment in favor of the United Kingdom.
Mossadegh emerged as a hero in his country and was propelled to international stardom. That year, the Times magazine named Mossadegh the Times Man of the Year, beating Churchill, who was also a contender. Options were running out for the British, so they initiated an embargo, preventing anyone from buying Iranian oil. The blockade decimated the Iranian economy. The British hoped that this would anger the Iranian people against Mossadegh, but to their surprise, it didn't. The 1950s was the beginning of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviets were pushing their ideological agenda across the globe, and Iran was no exception. There was a communist party in Iran called the Tudeh Party. Mossadegh, although not a communist, tolerated the Tudeh and felt that in a pluralistic democracy, people had the right to organize. What might have seemed like a pro-democracy stance was manipulated towards a pro-Soviet one. The British realized they could exploit this as a weakness. During President Truman's term, the United States was reluctant to involve itself in Iranian matters. The Truman administration felt that the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran reflected the values of the American people. In fact, Mossadegh and Truman had a great personal relationship. On July 21st, 1952, a power struggle emerged between the Shah and Mossadegh on who should control the military. Mossadegh demanded that he appoint the Minister of Defense. When the Shah refused, Mossadegh resigned, giving the British a prime opportunity to appoint a puppet prime minister in Iran. This appointment angered both Mossadegh supporters and the Tudeh Party, who joined forces in a protest against the Shah. Troops loyal to the Shah fired on the crowd, killing 67 people. 5 days later, Mossadegh returned to power as prime minister. Britain had completely run out of options. Rejecting the advice of the Truman administration, Britain planned to instigate a military coup. They looked towards General Zahedi, a man loyal to the Shah, to carry this out. Although he was a Nazi sympathizer and, according to British intelligence, untrustworthy, his raging anti-Mossadegh position made him the ideal candidate for the coup. Mossadegh got the news of what was happening and decided that his only option was to break diplomatic relations with the British. The embassy was shut down and all the British diplomats were kicked out. Everything changed when Dwight Eisenhower was elected as the President of the United States in January 1953. A meeting was arranged between Eisenhower and Churchill to discuss the Iran issue. The British knew that the Americans didn't really care about the British losing their oil fields, so instead, they made it look like the reason they wanted to get rid of Mossadegh was because he was a communist. And since the US were fighting communism around the world, this strategy worked.
Mr. Eisenhower arrived at the home of Mr. Bernard Baruch in New York for his long-awaited meeting with Mr. Churchill. In the house of the Premier's genial host, two old comrades of war and peace renewed their historic association before settling down to informal talks.
During this time, Mossadegh appointed Ashraf Dus as the chief of police, who was quite loyal to him. In the spring of 1953, Ashraf Dus was kidnapped and murdered under the direction of the MI6 operative Norman Derbyshire. His body was dumped publicly. This was to send a signal to the Iranian people that Mossadegh couldn't even protect his own chief of police. The final plot for the coup to take out Mossadegh was approved on July 11, 1953 by President Eisenhower and Prime Minister Churchill. It was codenamed Operation Ajax. The British and the American ambassadors of Iran went to the Shah to ask for his support for the coup against Mossadegh, but the Shah refused. So instead, they went to his twin sister, Ashraf, and bribed her to convince the Shah. She flew to Tehran to deliver the letter from the British and the Americans. The letter was a request to dissolve the parliament and appoint the new prime minister of Britain's choosing. The plan was for Mossadegh to reject this direct order from the Shah, which would ultimately result in his arrest. Enter Kermit Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a CIA agent and also the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. He crossed into Iran via Iraq with suitcases full of cash and started buying off journalists and newspaper editors to print stories on anti-Mossadegh propaganda, stating that he was a communist. This was all in preparation for the coup, as well as to signal to the outside world that they were getting rid of him because he was a communist. Eventually, a junior officer in the Royal Guard leaked the plans of the coup to Mossadegh. At midnight on the 16th of August 1953, the army sent tanks and officers to the Prime Minister's house. However, Mossadegh was prepared. As soon as the Royal Guards presented the letter from the Shah, they were arrested by Mossadegh's guards. The coup had failed miserably, and the Shah fled to Rome. The people cheered that the Shah had left. The US accepted the outcome and asked for Operation Ajax to be discontinued. Kermit Roosevelt was ready to leave, but Norman Derbyshire from the MI6 convinced him otherwise. Derbyshire had paid mercenaries to pretend to be Mossadegh and two-day communist supporters. They started rioting in the streets, pulling down statues of the Shah.
As anti-royalist partisans, supporters of the aged Dr. Mossadegh, set about their work of destruction. Target on which much bitter feeling was focused was the statue of the Shah's father.
This was used as a way to manipulate the narrative across the world that it was in fact Mossadegh that staged the coup against the Shah, not the other way around. Of course, this was false. On the morning of 19th August, 1953, this same mercenary mob, funded by the CIA and the MI6, came onto the streets once again, but this time showing pro-Shah sentiments. They began destroying shops, burning offices, and attacking pro-Mossadegh supporters. They began shouting, "Death to Mossadegh! Long live the Shah!" At 4:30 p.m. on the 19th of August, 1953, 28 tanks attacked Mossadegh's house. At this point, Mossadegh asked all his ministers to leave his house, as he wanted to die there alone. But the ministers insisted that he leave with them, or they'd all stay and die with him. He agreed and left. Later that day, General Zaidi was sworn in as prime minister on the orders of the Shah. The coup finally worked. The Shah returned to Iran on the 22nd of August, 1953. With $45 million from US aid, the Shah neutralized the opposition supporters, and Mossadegh was convicted for treason.
Backed by General Zahedi, military strongman, who engineered his return to power. The general will now have a strong voice in the newly formed government, whose cabinet has seen him with Shah Pahlavi.
Any officers associated with the two-day party were all executed. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was renamed BP, and Iran was required to share their oil with several other European and American oil companies. Eventually, Mossadegh was shifted from the military prison to Ahmedabad in Iran under house arrest. Mossadegh spent the rest of his life living in total solitude. According to most accounts, Mossadegh was a true leader of the nation, an intellect, one of the most prestigious figures in modern Iranian history. A leader who believed that Iranian oil should be for the Iranian people, but a leader who was ultimately overthrown by the powers whose interests lied not with the will of the Iranian people, but rather in the resources and wealth of Iran. On March 5th, 1967, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh died due to complications with cancer. He was secretly buried in the living room of his home in Ahmedabad. In 1979, the Shah would ultimately flee the country again for the final time. The truth is, the seeds of the 1979 Iranian Revolution were sown in 1953. The betrayal of the US and the UK of the Iranian democracy forever severed the trust between Iran and the West. It will always remain a mystery. What if the US and the UK had not overthrown Iran's first democratically elected leader? Would the 1979 revolution ever happen? Would those Americans have been kidnapped in Tehran? Would Jimmy Carter have won a second term? Where would Iran be today? And what would the Middle East look like? I suppose we'll never know.